Welcome to episode 451 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Andrew Swafford.
Michael O'Malley.
Today's episode, we're going to be kicking off our annual Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1927's The Jazz Singer, which has been on the ballot for a number of years, and finally we're now forcing ourselves to watch it. Reckon with it.
Every once in a while, like every couple of years with the Young Critics Watch Old Movies series, we have to watch a movie that we know we're gonna just like despise, but it's like historically significant in some way, so we have to just like reckon with it. I think that was the word that Zach used in our Slack chat. We need to reckon with The Jazz Singer.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what we'll be doing.
So stay tuned to see if this movie is one that we enjoyed or not.
Spoiler alert, it is not.
The suspense.
It sucks.
But you ain't heard.
What's in
wow.
part two? We got I think overall like more positive movies in part one. So I'm gonna go ahead
Absolutely.
and jump into that. We're gonna kick it off because the movie came out around, and we had seen it, but it came out around the time of the 450th episode. So we have not had a chance on the podcast to talk yet about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse.
Mm-hmm.
It's the latest in the Spider-Verse, I guess, trilogy.
It's a trilogy. Well, there might
seems to be a
there might be
trilogy
any
now.
number of Spider-Verse movies.
That's true.
Higher than 3.
If they end the next movie on a to be continued again, I'm not seeing the first one. I see the fourth one if it starts a new plot.
That's
I
fair.
agree. I think that's a good principled stance.
So this, for those who are unfamiliar, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse came out 2018. Has it been that long? 2018, 2019?
Yeah, it's been a long time, man.
And
whole
kind of like,
pandemic.
yeah, it was like a movie that immediately caught people's attention. Just the animation itself was kind of the takeaway for, I think, for the large part. It, really integrated like. It kind of felt like an actual comic book movie compared to like the Thors and the Avengers and the Flash and stuff like that are coming out now. But this one stars Spider-Man is instead of Peter Parker is Miles Morales. This one, you after reuniting with Gwen Stacy, Brooklyn's full-time friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is catapulted across the multiverse, where he encounters the Spider Society, a team of spider people charged with protecting the multiverse's very existence. But when the heroes clash on how to handle a new threat, Miles finds himself pitted against the other spiders and must set out on his own to save those he loves most.
And that's about 3/4 of the movie. That's synopsis.
Yeah.
Also, the trailer I think had like the climactic battle in it, like a lot of the big moments from that.
Yeah, I didn't watch the trailer, so yeah. Well, yeah, let's. I guess let's jump into it, Michael. I'm gonna start with you on Spider-Verse.
I said this on Letterboxd in my review, but I went in as a skeptic. I was like, I'm really, I used to love Spider-Man, and in the same way I used to love Star Wars, and it's just like I'm burned out. Like the direction that a lot of the character takes have moved the character, Andrew Garfield and then Tom Holland. Like I was not ready for more Spider-Man, even though I really liked Into the Spider-Verse, but I was like, I don't know. And this movie won me over, which I think says something for the aesthetic of the movie more than anything else, and also says something for like the first like 30 minutes of the movie, which is like perfect. I think like the movie opens like from Spider-Gwen's perspective and like how her life goes after the first Spider-Verse movie, and it's just kind of this melancholy thing where as Spider-Man tends to be, as Spider people tend to be, kind of lonely, isolated from others because they can't tell their secret identity, but that's the very wedge that's driving between them and their loved ones. Like, but it's really well evoked in this movie, and it's really melancholy, and she just wants to go back and reconnect with Miles because she's like, he's the only person who's a teenager and B, connected with in this whole thing, and I just want to go back to him. And like that opening like won me over, and not the least of which for the reason that it looks incredible. Like I don't know that I realized this in the other movie because we mostly stay inside Miles's universe, but the kind of aesthetic conceit of the Spider-Verse movie seems to be that not just the spider people, but the entire world that they inhabit is like of a different aesthetic that matches themselves. And so like Gwen has this like watercolor aesthetic that looks incredible, I think. And watching it, I was watching this in the theater, as everybody would at this point, but like this was the first theatrical experience in a very long time where I'm like, I'm seeing something that I didn't think, like I didn't know I hadn't seen before, but I'm seeing it now. Like specifically with the animation, and it's just like incredibly cool. And the movie kind of never stops doing that. Like there's moments in which it kind of calms down and becomes more conventional, but like for the most part, like at a pretty consistent clip, you're just introduced to new aesthetic risks and experiments that this movie just keeps throwing at you. There's like a punk rock Spider-Man that comes in, and he's like this like weird like papery aesthetic, and
Looks like a zine.
yeah, he looks like a zine. There's an actual paper Spider-Man universe that's apparently in like the a Renaissance that's like with Leonardo da Vinci and stuff, and that's all like sketches and stuff, and that's really
Honestly,
cool.
I wanted to like dive into that one more. That sounded
Absolutely.
fascinating.
Yeah, there's like a vulture that comes out of it at the near the beginning of the movie. But just like over and over again, this movie like introduces like cool aesthetic things that was true of the initial Into the Spider-Verse as well. But the kind of Into the Spider-Verse was kind of like proof of concept, right? Like the entire style of the movie, like that kind of like dropped frame, like comic book splash page style, like that was what was really compelling about that movie. This movie is like, okay, we proved that we can like do this style. Now let's see what else we can do that's like a divergence from that style. And I like really love that. But you know, I was also into the characters. Like I think like Gwen and Miles both like get really good emotional cores to their stories. And it eventually gets like complicated in ways that I don't know how productive they're going to be once we get the third movie. This is kind of like it feels like how I felt at the end of the Pirates of the Caribbean sequel when I first saw it in 2000 whatever 4 or whenever that came out, which was like, are you serious? I don't get to see the end of this story. And in the case of the Pirates movies, I saw the end of the story and I'm like, oh, so the story didn't matter at all. And it's, returning those movies is the style that I'm interested in.
Just vibes and Pirates, man.
Yeah, it's just vibes, and I'm curious if that is going to be the case with this movie, because you can kind of feel this movie shifting into like epic mode at the end, and you're like, oh, okay, this movie's not going to wrap up in a whole movie, because it's not explicitly marketed as a part one, but it is a part one.
Yeah, well, it's like you get to the I don't think it's too spoiler, but because I mentioned it in the log line, but you get to the Spider Society or whatever, and like at that point, I was just like, I was in the theater, so I didn't want to look at my phone, but I'm like, there can't be that much. Like, how much more time?
You're like over an hour in, and they keep introducing new plots rather than addressing the old ones.
That's like an hour and a half plus in. Like I don't think they like introduced those people until like an hour 30 or hour 45 in. You're like, how long is this movie?
And then after they do introduce those people, it's just a chase sequence for the rest of the movie.
It's like vamping up to a climax to say to be continued, basically. And
yeah.
I was taken by it. Like I've not like been this invested. Like I wasn't this like into a superhero plot since like I can't even remember the last superhero movie where I was into the plot. But I was into this plot, but I can imagine the third movie kind of fumbling this and it just making it gobbledygook, like collapsing under the mythology, and then returning to this movie and being like, oh, I can see the seeds of disaster here, and I'm just interested in the vibes. But for now, like, I'm very surprised to say, like, I want to know what happens, because there's kind of like it's not a reveal, it's not a twist, but it leaves it like at this cliffhanger where it's like suddenly put Miles and Gwen in this situation where you're like, I want to know how this resolves. And it's a very typical like cliffhanger type scenario that I'm sure will resolve in the first like 15 minutes of the next movie. But I actually want to know. Like, and that's a weird feeling. It's been a long time since like this kind of like serial like IP movie has like sucked me in on a plot level. And I reserve the right to say I was wrong because this third movie can't, actually follow through on this. But like I was into the plot this whole time in addition to the style, which is not something I was expecting. Anyway, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I'll echo what you said about the kind of preamble first act, I guess, if you want to describe it that way. So the preamble is the kind of Gwen stuff, and then the first act is when you like meet Miles again.
Right, and then Gwen shows up again. That's like all through like the first. That's the part that I think is really good.
All of that stuff is great. Yeah, that's excellent. I like the characters. And the animation is all the kind of, for the most part, all the superlatives and the hyperbole that people have said about it is warranted. I felt like the story though in this one was a mess. Like just a flat out it's systematic. I feel like of most multiverse movies, which is like it's like this. You look at it as like this world of endless possibilities, but then it just like is so limited because it's like it's almost like having like, you know, that orb of power, and you're like, there's so much power here, and you're like, yeah, I don't think you needed that much. And so I feel like because they had
also, it kind of like saps it of power because so few of those possibilities mean anything or matter.
And I was reading this about I think it was a review of The Flash. It was one of the multiverse movies, and they were talking about just the multiverse narrative now in general, in that, you know, people are really like into it, like, oh, it's this, you know, it offers this possibility to kind of like do all these different things, but at the same time it actually is more limiting, because you could be like, oh, you know, Gwen dies. She doesn't in the movie, but like Gwen dies in this universe, and then you just go to another universe and you can find another Gwen and, like, you know, fix it to a degree. Like it kind of takes consequences away, or it limits the consequences because there's always another universe.
I think I read that same piece, and I actually disagree with that point, which is that like this movie makes a fairly explicit idea that none of these spider universes, whatever we're calling it, there's a character who says in a kind of like traditional Lord and Miller style, like, this is a dumb name, and I agree it's a dumb name. I can't believe we're still talking about Spider-Verse, but the movie does make a point of saying like each of these individual spider people has something distinct about them, and they're not just, it's not a multiverse in the sense of like there's literally infinite Spider-Men or spider people out there. It's a multiverse in the sense of like each spider story is a little bit different. And so like if Gwen died, this Gwen would not be replaced by an identical Gwen. Like she's the end of...
There's also the thing about the canon events.
Yeah, I was going to say.
That the movie introduces.
Yeah.
Suggesting like there's certain things that are always going to happen no matter which version of the Spider-Verse you're looking at. Right. And the movie kind of presents like that as a problem to be solved. It's all about like saving the Uncle Ben figure in X multiverse.
Right. But like, if this Gwen Stacy died, it wouldn't just be that Miles could find an identical Gwen Stacy and be like, now I feel better. Like, this Gwen Stacy is important for the specific set of experiences this Gwen Stacy has had. It's not as
his relationship with her.
And his relationship with her. So it's not as if they can find an identical universe in which she's had the exact same set of experiences, because that doesn't seem to exist. Every spider person is slightly different. But I do agree that, like, in general, I find the multiverse conceit of movies to be really overwhelming and often dispiriting, because it's just a way of like shoring up brand management. Like, I haven't seen that Flash movie, but like bringing back the Michael Keaton Batman, like there's nothing but cynical reasons for doing that. Like, you know, I didn't even see the Spider-Man, like Tom Holland Spider-Man that did the whole multiverse thing, but there's nothing but cynical reasons for bringing back Tobey Maguire and Alfred Molina and all those folks. So like I get that in general, but in this movie I didn't actually feel that, which is like a magic trick that may be burst in the next movie.
The other thing I just felt, and this is my issue with the multiverse movies, is that it just also creates, like, it doesn't feel very like streamlined. Like I never felt like there was a streamlined narrative. Like I understand what the narrative cohesive line was in this movie, but it just kind of felt like it constantly was throwing, like, and I think that's just the nature of like what this is it's just new things like constantly being thrown. I mean, that's kind of Lord Miller's thing. You look back to, you know, like the Lego movie and things like that. Like they're constantly kind of throwing gags and throwaways and characters and just stuff at you. And so like by the time, especially when we got to like the spider people, like the base of all the spider people, like I was just so like like narratively exhausted because they're just showing you all of these different spider people, and I'm just like, can we just focus on like the 4 that I need to care about to get through this narrative? Because you have so many goddamn characters that you're throwing at me that I'm supposed to like feel for, and I'm like, no, just tell a damn story, and you're just trying to throw stuff. And I maybe that's not a whole multiverse thing, that maybe that's just like a kind of Lord Miller type thing, but I'm just like, by that point I was so exhausted. I was just like, I can't, like, what the fuck is the point of this movie?
Yeah, I mean, I am pretty firmly on Zach's side here. I went into this movie a little bit skeptical, but wanting to love it because I loved Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, which still holds up.
And I think that by the time that movie came out, 2018, we were all like very on record as being really over the superhero thing. Like this podcast can sometimes just feel like a recurring conversation of like how much superhero movies are kind of hollowing out the industry right now. But even when we were in that mindset, Into the Spider-Verse felt like absolutely electrifyingly good. And like that was to do with both the visual style and the movie's approach to narrative. And like it was narratively radical, not only because it was playing with the multiverse thing before that had kind of become passé, but also like it was a superhero movie that felt self-contained, which the superhero movies in 2018 already did not feel self-contained. And I think that the multiverse thing is just kind of a worsening of that problem. Like, not only does every movie have to be like the setup for the next one, it's like selling you on the franchise, but we are like actively shoring up against any possibility the franchise could ever end. Like, we have to like keep it going forever and ever and ever. There have to be infinite versions of this for us to keep selling to an audience. And like that chafed me a little bit more this time, after we have kind of seen the way that the multiverse trope has developed from the last several years. But also, I just agree with Zach what you said, that the narrative itself is a mess. Like, I just don't think this story is any good, really. I do like the first 30 minutes when it's all just about the relationship between Miles and Gwen. But once it becomes this, like, really zoomed out thing, it no longer feels like it has any narrative weight to me. Like, I keep getting introduced to characters that I don't care about because they're just throwaway gags. And the characters that I am supposed to care about that get introduced in the last half of the film, like the character who ends up kind of chasing Miles's Spider-Man through all these Spider-Verses, I could not give less of a shit about. Like, this guy is such an uninteresting villain. And you know who is an interesting villain? The freaking Black Spot.
Yeah.
That they introduced in the first 30 minutes of the movie.
Great villain.
I was loving that section, and I like really wanted to see him. I like the idea of him being introduced as a villain of the week, but then becoming the main antagonist.
He's also a fun like follow-up on like a throwaway gag from the first movie. Like, he's in the first movie.
Oh, really? I actually did not remember him from the first movie. Oh, that's true. That is true. But yeah, then the movie just like completely abandons that character, possibly because it thinks the exploring the multiverse thing is more interesting, possibly because they're setting him up to be a really big bad in the second or the third movie, or it's just kind of a bait and switch because the real big bad is going to be like the Dark Miles that gets introduced at the very, very end. Sorry, that's a spoiler, but who gives a shit? Everybody's seen this movie. This movie is like doing crazy numbers. It's getting like 5-star reviews left and fucking right on Letterboxd. I think it's hype. I think that everybody loves their favorite little boy Spider-Man, and like this, it just feels like that plus multiverse trendiness, plus the like admittedly amazing animation. Like, I will not say any bad words about the animation. The animation's incredible, but even incredible animation cannot save a movie with a script this bad, in my opinion.
I disagree.
Go ahead.
I think that the hype that you're referring to is not necessarily hype. It is what people serially refuse to acknowledge about movies, which is that they are emotive, aesthetic experiences more than like like point A to point B plot stuff. And the movies that focus on point A to point B plot stuff are the movies that tend to be less interesting unless the point A to point B plot stuff is very clever. And I think that like enough people are responding to this movie that I don't know. I think the aesthetics are carrying it. Like I will say, like I don't think, except for the really comic book nerd people, which this movie really caters to, because like the only reason you would care about the villain in this movie is because he's a reference to a really like deeply maligned like plot in like the Spider-Man series. But like unless you're like one of those folks, like I think the aesthetics are carrying it. It's kind of like the Avatar movie from last December or whatever. I don't think on a deep level people cared about the whales. I cared about the whales, but you know, what I cared about the whales is because they were rendered in an aesthetically compelling way. Like the plot of the movie doesn't make you want to care about the whales even any more than the trees or whatever. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know. Like that's my argument. And there's never been a time when a third movie that picked up the second movie's to be continued actually delivered on it. Like I can't think of one that did. So I'll probably be wrong about this, but I am willing to suspend judgment on the plot of this movie because it is a first half of a movie as it was revealed, and it will probably not fulfill all the things it sets up, but
I get that, but like I rewatched the first Spider-Verse before going to see this one, and that the plot's kind of sloppy. It's not. I'm not gonna say it's perfect, but it at least has like a very like kind of like. It has. It feels like cohesive and as Andrew said, like it feels complete within that story. And like I get that this
movie is not. This movie is not.
And again, like we mentioned, it's a part 1, part 2 situation. But like at least like I feel like you still have to have some sort of like there has to be some like full circle to a degree that you come to, even in like a to be continued, where you have to come to some sort of conclusion. You can't just like push all of that off into another thing and be like, well,
I agree.
That'll come.
I agree. To be clear, I do not like that it's to be continued. Once I realized that that's what was going to happen in this movie, I was frustrated.
Like it's honestly going to become like a 4.5 hour, 5 hour movie where you're just watching the whole Across the Spider-Verse.
This thing is 2.5 hours, which is way too long, I think.
Which is that's what also annoys me, that you can't come to some full circle within 2.5 hours, even though you're teasing a second part.
You need a bigger canvas than that to tell your little superbug story.
Yeah, like shut up.
The thing I was thinking about walking out of the movie was the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 2, which does a kind of similar thing with the Be Continued in the sense of like there's one major thread from Spider-Man 2 that is not resolved, which is like Harry and him taking up the Green Goblin mantle and all that sort of stuff. But everything else in that movie comes full circle, and you're just left with the one hook to see the next one. And
I disagree, but that's fine.
Spider-Man 3 does not deliver.
Yeah, the way that they
that.
follow up that plot line involves Harry Osmond becoming really into painting.
Yeah, like Spider-Man 3 is a movie with its positives and negatives, but one of the positives is not that it fulfills the promise of Spider-Man 2's hook.
What is the drill tweet of like every generation needs at least 3 movies named Spider-Man 2?
Spider-Man 2.
Like I think it'd be interesting to look back once Beyond the Spider-Verse, the third one, comes out. It would be interesting to compare like the Spider-Man trilogies that exist, because there are now at least 3 of them, right? There's the Sam Raimi trilogy, there's the MCU trilogy, and there's this one. And I remember when the third film in the MCU trilogy came out, No Way Home, my students would not stop asking me my thoughts on that movie. And like I told them I was not going to see it. Like I'd kind of like sworn off of like keeping up with any MCU stuff a long time ago. But like I remember the breathless praise that movie got, partially for the way that it played with multiverse stuff. And this movie is kind of doing that same trick again, but like in a way that almost erases the cultural memory of the old one. Like now that this is out, I doubt anybody really even wants to rewatch No Way Home. And to my point,
I think that was true before this one came out.
That was true before this one came out.
Movies are ephemeral.
Because that's the point I'm trying to make. These Marvel movies are ephemeral. Like a lot of the big successful ones come out to like this great breathless acclaim, and then they are forgotten weeks later. And so like I don't want to get on the bandwagon for this one. I think that it's not what it is cracked up to be.
I definitely feel like this one like has legs. Like I think this is 100% like it's not a like a Guardians of the Galaxy 3 or something like that, where it's like it gets kind of hyped and then it just disappears. You forget that it was even a movie. I definitely think that this series has legs. Like it really does. Just from what I've seen, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Letterboxd, like younger people talking about it, like it does have like that, like the young movie going that that are starting to become more active movie going generation has really responded to this. I was for the most part relatively positive to this. It's the story thing is just more. I think you just had to kind of have something that was driving it a little bit more, other than just kind of, just assaulting us with like all the different animations. Like that is fantastic, but there's still, I feel like you could still do something, because you have like we talked about at the beginning, you have interesting characters. Gwen and Miles are really interesting. Like you really could be doing something with it. And so mine's more just kind of like I don't know. I'm not gonna, this ain't like this is not gonna appear, I can already tell you, on the like top 10 of my year or anything. But I also wasn't like this was
cemetery like top 10, because lots of people
it probably will be, and that'll be a fun conversation we'll have in December.
I might put it on mine. I guess the only reason I'm willing to plant my flag here is that even if the plot completely falls apart in a part 2, which it most likely will, I think that like I mentioned with the Pirates movies, like I was into the plot of like in the mythology of the Pirates movies in that second movie, and then I was like, this is nonsense. And I realized that, and going back to those movies, recognizing that the plot is nonsense and that you kind of vibe with these characters and the cinematic style is the allure of those movies now. Like even knowing that the plot falls apart. And I think that like the aesthetic, like ambition of this movie is enough that like you can vibe with it. Those Pirates movies are very long too. They're at least as long as this movie, and they hold up on exclusively the like Gore Verbinski like wacky acrobatics and thing. And I think that this movie could do the same, even if the plot completely falls apart, which it would be a shame, because I do like these characters, but I am willing to have the animation.
Well, we've gone like 30 minutes on Spider-Verse, so let's move off of that. We have other stuff to talk about. Andrew, I'm gonna toss it over to you, and let's talk about a movie that is a literal like 180 from what this movie is.
I'm getting flashbacks when we talked about Air and Showing Up, though I think Spider-Verse is better than Air, and this movie is probably not as good as Showing Up, but it's good. It's worth seeing. The movie we're talking about is what's it called?
You Hurt My Feelings.
You Hurt My Feelings.
You Hurt My Feelings.
You Hurt My Feelings by Nicole Holofcener.
Not aesthetically ambitious.
Not an aesthetically ambitious movie. It is just kind of Nicole Holofcener doing her almost like this would be really high-end Netflix fare, I think, like that kind of dramedy, like set in a kind of upper class milieu.
Dude, let's just say it. It's a Woody Allen type movie.
It's a Woody Allen type beat.
Like,
yeah,
it's exactly that kind of movie without the like weird sexual stuff.
It doesn't have any sort of weird metafictive eccentricities that a Woody Allen movie might have. But this movie is about a husband and wife. Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays the wife. This guy who I've been seeing in more and more stuff recently, Tobias. Menzies, I think is how you say his name.
He's a big he does more in the UK.
Yeah, he's amazing in Outlander. Outlander, he plays two characters, and he is a really important recurring character throughout the entire show. I am really excited to see him get more leading roles in movies. I think he's a fantastic actor.
I'm surprised he hasn't after, because Outlander's a big, super popular show, and he's been prominent in it. But yeah, I mean, I was talking to somebody about it, and I was like, yeah, that's probably the most prominent thing, but everything else, it's like UK stuff.
So part of the appeal of this movie, before even getting into plot stuff, is just kind of like seeing these really good actors act. Like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, when is the last time you saw her as the lead in a comedic movie that was playing in multiplexes in America?
The last Nicole Holofcener movie.
The last Nicole Holofcener movie, that's right. In this movie, she plays a writer, a creative writing professor, and a once published writer working on her second book. And
I think she's written a couple things.
Maybe you're right.
It's her second book, though. She's done a memoir, and then there's the novel that she's working on.
Yeah, so this is the first novel she's ever done.
She has that monologue about, but there were those Atlantic articles.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is honestly a nice touch.
It is. Yeah, there's a lot of nice little touches to this. Like the script is very witty, and there's lots of detail that just feels amusing in how lived in it feels, right? But her husband is a counselor. He both gives therapy sessions to individuals and also couples, one of which is David Cross and his real life spouse Amber Tamblyn, who are just the absolute worst partners to one another. And he takes the approach of just hearing them out and letting them hear from each other and trying not to intervene. And that just kind of makes things worse in a lot of aspects of his life. And
he has the great line, he's like, are you going to do anything? We can just do this at home.
We could just do this at home, yeah. And one way in which this character's aversion to conflict kind of manifests is the main conflict of this movie, and that is he doesn't really like the manuscript for the book that his wife has just written, and she has asked him for feedback on it many times. He has read it cover to cover many times. He always says that it's great. He doesn't actually like it. It's kind of a white lie that he's telling to make sure that he's continuing to encourage his spouse's ambitions. But this kind of comes to a head when she overhears him having what he thought was a private conversation with a mutual friend, in which he says how he really feels about the book, which is not really even that negative, just that it's not really for him. He's like, I could see why other people might like it. This is not my kind of story, right? I don't feel like I'm a good judge of this kind of story. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus does not respond positively to hearing this, and the rest of the movie is just kind of a relitigation, kind of an almost endless relitigation of this couple's sense of codependency and their inability to express discomfort or disagreement with one another. And it, there are elements about this movie that feel kind of basic and kind of lazy, I guess, mostly the aesthetic of it. But in terms of the writing and the character work here and the acting, for the most part, it is a really well-observed, nuanced story about the inner workings of marriage. Usually movies about marriage are about kind of looking for the one and then finding the one, and that's the end of the movie. And this movie is about being in a relationship that has lasted for decades, and the weird, small, petty squabbles that can kind of get blown up out of proportion when certain dynamics have persisted for that long. And I thought that was a cool story to tell. I liked it.
Well, it's it's a symptom of all of her movies to a degree. You know, the thing I like about Nicole Holofcener is that she also doesn't make likable characters.
Right. Yeah.
She just lets them be assholes. Like,
Yeah,
she's just unrepentant assholes.
Like you leave this movie and it's I agree with you. Like it's really witty. It has a lot of funny moments. Everybody is good in this movie for, you know, especially Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Tobias Menzies. But I don't like any of the people. Like I don't like any of the people in this movie. Like they're all
like the son.
I like the son and the dad.
Like they're just kind of like they're just like wholly, they can just be so unlikable and asshole-ish, but which I honestly like appreciate, because like I think you sometimes like need that like represented sometimes, where it's just like, yeah, like this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, naturally like you gravitate to her, she's the central character, you're kind of empathizing with her. It's super tough to empathize her in a lot of this movie, because mainly just because of the stuff that she does or stuff that she says, and it's like it's kind of like that's from what's the like the dinner with friends or whatever that she made early on, stuff like all of her movies really have like these have a lot of characters who are like just kind of, you can't necessarily immediately jump on with them because you're just like, man, that person's kind of an asshole. And I think she plays it really wonderfully.
Was great
there.
in like the early Nicole Holofcener movies.
Yeah,
as like Julia Louis-Dreyfus has kind of like become like what Catherine Keener was early on.
That's it's, but no, I really like this as well. It's, I think I agree, like the point you made at the beginning, like this would be a good, I hope that like it pops on a Netflix or something like that, like a streaming service that can become more widely available. I think it's one of those it's those movies that like I know that you've heard like somebody like Ben Affleck talk about, where it's like these like mid-level kind of non-showy movies that like normally like used to do pretty well at the theaters and like were a nice like kind of fare that wasn't the blockbuster stuff, but now has just become completely droned out by movie theaters really emphasizing the bigger movies and the stuff like that. And so like this mid-tier movie like You Hurt My Feelings just really doesn't have a place unless you have like an art house theater, or you catch it later on a streaming service, or you rent it on iTunes. But yeah, I recommend it. I think it's real strong. And I really enjoyed the like few scenes where they go and visit the Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Michaela Watkins character's mother.
Oh my god!
Oh my gosh, she was so good.
The woman who plays Steven Spielberg's grandmother in The Fabelmans. She's so
Jeannie
good.
Berlin, like just fantastic.
Yeah. To your point, Zach, unless I'm missing one, I think the last Nicole Holofcener movie was direct to Netflix. Like, I think that this is a relative fluke for her to get back in the theater. And I listened to a couple interviews with her where she basically has resigned herself to like, if this movie doesn't perform well at the box office, I know that streaming is just going to be like my future forever. And that's kind of sad. Although she did script that. What was the Last Duel? She scripted part of that movie, which also didn't do well theatrically. So
these movies you saw this week get bleaker and bleaker as we talk about how certain movies are doing.
It is interesting to like talk about this in the context of Spider-Verse, because this is like the polar opposite of Spider-Verse, which is that like the cinematic style is not bad, but it is the opposite of ambitious, right? Like
it is serviceable.
You could find a movie in the 70s that was filmed in the exact same way. There's nothing trying to be ambitious. It's merely competent. And the whole point is to foreground an interesting and very tight script, which I think is like a really good script. And Spider-Verse is the opposite, right? Like it's, we're doing this extremely hardcore, like, animation to sell a terribly a messy script. But I really like this movie too, because it's just fun. I don't know. There's like this kind of genre of movie that I got really burned out on for a while. Like the kind of like, I don't know, you call it like Sundance movies or that sort of thing, where it's like, mostly like low stakes, kind of domestic squabbles, done in a kind of like dramedy format. Like you can get really tired of those movies, but when a good one like clicks, you're like, man, I really miss seeing these movies a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a tired point for film critics to make because it gets made constantly, but there just aren't enough movies like this that are just kind of mid-budget, mid-range of quality, but made like for adults and about like real life. Not everything has to be where we're traipsing through the multiverse for superpowers,
I do think that there are a lot of movies made like this, but there's not a lot of movies made well, and there's not a lot of movies made well that get theatrical distribution.
And that's the point I've made is like these movies are being made, but like the market is so segmented now. Even 20, 30 years ago, you had like a handful of movie studios, and you're like, that's where the movies are coming out of. So I 100% know what's coming out. Now you have so many different movie studios, so many different streaming, like shit's just coming from everywhere. So like it's coming out, but like because you're having to look in 100 different directions, you can't keep up necessarily with it all. I mean, even something as like big and popular as a studio like A24, there's so many A24 movies. I mean, this is an A24 movie. Did y'all know this was an A24 movie? Like exactly, that's a big studio. It just won an Oscar for Best Picture, and it's putting out big stuff, but it also has just random stuff that comes out, like showing up in this movie that are A24 movies that you're like, I didn't even know.
The only reason this got a theatrical distribution too.
They are a little selective on what they actually give theatrical distribution now, because a lot of their movies they will just hide on some streaming service, Joel Coen's Macbeth just got put on Apple TV Plus, and you can't see it if you don't have Apple TV Plus.
But that did get a theatrical push, though, right? I
very
saw it in
small
theaters.
one.
In New York and
we
LA.
had Central Cinema that showed it.
Packed screening at Central Cinema. But
or something like Kogonada's After Yang only played on Showtime.
yeah, that was impossible to find.
Anyway, I think there's no like easy solution to it. It's just because we have so many different places and things like putting out content. It's not that they're not being made. It's just that they're being distributed and they're on top of 100 other things being distributed that it's tough to like zero down.
You're getting buried.
And that's not even considering the movies that hit festivals that never get distributed.
Yeah.
But I mean, just to compare this movie to like Rye Lane, a movie that we've talked about on this podcast, which I think is also in kind of, it's not the exact same movie because it's not for middle-aged people like this movie is, but it is a mid-budget movie for like, with like a kind of dramedy edge. Like that's on Hulu. People talked about it a little bit like on film podcasts, but like, did it enter the popular culture beyond film podcasts at all? I don't think so. Like I don't know a single person in the real world who has seen Rye Lane except for the people on this podcast.
I haven't even seen Rye Lane yet.
There you go.
I need to.
You're part of the problem. Andrew. All right. Well, I really wanted to talk about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but we're at 42 minutes, so I'm gonna just say I'm gonna save it, and I can package it with maybe Asteroid City in a couple of weeks when we have our next episode. But quick review: Close Encounters of the Third Kind, man. Movies.
You also saw Heat this week.
Fucking movies, y'all.
Real movie week for Zach.
I had never watched Heat, and I finally was just gonna. I got my TV set up, and it was like all nice, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna just dive in. It's time to finally like wreck. It was again. I got to reckon with Heat.
It's a easier.
And let
reckoning.
me tell you, it was an just immaculate vibes. Pacino is just like going off, like he's talking about asses, I'm just like this is a goddamn movie, Michael Mann movies shot at night. Like
Zach, you've seen Miami Vice, right?
That's another one. I haven't watched Miami Vice.
I haven't seen that either.
I don't know, man. That's another. I'm saying, that's my thing is I try not to see everything because then you save it and it's like a moment like when I saw these two movies and I'm just like fucking movies, man.
Yeah.
On the other hand, sometimes you see a movie that's a classic like The Jazz Singer and then you watch it and we have part 2.
Coming up next.
Nice
Smooth.
transition.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. You ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you. You ain't heard nothing. You want to hear Toot Toot Tootsie? All right. Hold on. No, listen. Play Toot Toot Tootsie. 3 choruses, you understand? And the 3rd chorus, I whistle. Now give it to him hard and heavy. Go right ahead. Toot Toot Tootsie. Goodbye. Toot Toot Tootsie. Don't cry. The little choo-choo train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me goody and then out.
And we're back with part 2 of episode 451 of Cemetery. In this part, we're going to be kicking off our latest Young Critics Watch Old Movies series with 1927's The Jazz Singer, directed by Alan Crosland from a script by Alfred A. Cohen. The film stars Al Jolson, May McAvoy, Warner Olin, and Yoseli Rosenblatt. Is it Jakey or Jackie? Jakey?
I thought it was.
I'm gonna say Jakey.
Yeah, Jakey sounds right. Naked
All right,
Jakey.
young Jakey Rabinowitz loves jazz and ragtime and wants to be a performer. But his father is a cantor, and he orders his son to carry on the family tradition. Jakey tries his hand anyway, only to be discovered by neighbor Moisha Udelson and kicked out of the house. A decade later, an older Jakey has followed his dream, changed his name, and found love with performer Mary, but he still wants to win his father over. According to modern sources, author Samson Raphaelson was inspired to write his short story A Day of Atonement after seeing Al Jolson perform Where the Black-Eyed Susans Grow. I checked that. It's a flower. Okay.
He has an extensive history
in
of blackface.
It's fine. I wanted to make sure.
One of the few there he wasn't
In
blackface.
In 1925, the short story was expanded into a novel as well as a hit Broadway play, both titled The Jazz Singer. Although George Jessel starred in the Broadway show, Warner Brothers advertised the film as a, quote, biography of Jolson, whose father, a cantor, had initially opposed his show business career. With George Jessel in the lead role, the show performed at the Warner Theater in Times Square in September 1925 and became a hit. Warner Brothers acquired the movie rights to the play on June 4th, 1926, and signed Jessel to a contract. But the plans to make the film with Jessel would fall through for multiple reasons, namely contractual issues. Then came another major issue. According to Jessel, a first read of screenwriter Alfred A. Cohen's adaptation, quote, threw me into a fit. Instead of the boys leaving the theater and following the traditions of his father by singing in the synagogue, as in the play, the picture scenario had him return to the Winter Garden as a black-faced comedian, with his mother wildly applauding in the box. I raised hell. Money or no money, I would not do this.
Wow. Woke king.
Describing Jolson as the production's best choice for its star, film historian Donald Crafton wrote, quote, the entertainer who sang jazzed-up minstrel numbers in blackface was at the height of his phenomenal popularity. Anticipating the later stardom of crooners and rock stars, Jolson electrified audiences with the vitality and sex appeal of his songs and gestures, which owed much to black American sources. End quote.
Man, I am still very hung up on I would not do this. Like, this reminds me of one of the most popular reviews of the movie The Empty Man on Letterboxd, which just says, I hope this does not happen to me.
Experimental sound on disc sequences utilizing a variety of techniques had been produced periodically even before the beginning of the 20th century. Among them was the 1926 Warner Brothers film Don Juan, which had musical accompaniment and sound effects. Although The Jazz Singer was not the first, quote, talking picture, or the first to have some synchronized sound or dialogue segments, its enormous success was a significant factor in the rapid transition of the motion picture industry from silent to sound films. A Vitaphone trailer for The Jazz Singer, which was made to promote the picture as it opened across the country, featured actor John Miljon, who spoke about the picture and introduced brief excerpts. As noted by film historians, the trailer, which was the first sound trailer, actually contained more spoken dialogue than The Jazz Singer itself. In total, the movie contains barely 2 minutes worth of synchronized talking, much or all of it improvised. The rest of the dialogue is presented through caption cards or intertitles, standard in silent movies of the era. As was common, those titles were composed not by the film's scenarist, Alfred Cohen, but by another writer, in this case, Jack Jarmuth. The production cost for The Jazz Singer was $422,000, approximately $5.35 million in 2021 dollars, a large sum, especially for Warner Brothers, which rarely spent more than $250,000 on a movie. According to Warner Brothers records, the film earned revenues of $1.9 million in the U.S. and Canada and $651,000 everywhere else, for a worldwide theatrical gross of approximately $2.6 million. The film developed into a major hit, demonstrating the profit potential of feature-length talkies, but Crafton has shown that the reputation the film later acquired for being one of Hollywood's most enormous successes to date was inflated. The movie did well, but not astonishingly so, in the major cities where it was first released, garnering much of its impressive profits, with long, steady runs in population centers, large and small, all around the country. As conversion of movie theaters to sound was still in its early stages, the film actually arrived at many of those secondary venues in a silent version. On the other hand, Crafton's statement that The Jazz Singer, quote, was in a distinct second or third tier of attractions compared to the most popular films of the day and even other Vitaphone talkies is also incorrect. In fact, the film was easily the biggest earner in Warner Brothers history and would remain so until it was surpassed a year later by The Singing Fool, another Jolson feature. In the larger scope of Hollywood, among films originally released in 1927, available evidence suggests that The Jazz Singer was among the three biggest box office hits, trailing only Wings and perhaps The King of Kings. The picture has had several special anniversary screenings since 1927 and was officially reissued in 1958. According to an October 1958 Hollywood Reporter news item, the film was opened at the Symphony Theater, where it was to be heftily exploited in cash in where possible on the novelty value of the old timer. On October 6, 1977, the United States Postal Service issued a special commemorative stamp marking the 50th anniversary of Talking Pictures. At that time, according to an LA Times article, the LA City Council, or an LA City Council member for Hollywood, suggested that the old Warner Brothers Hollywood studio, where the picture was filmed, and the home of television station KTLA and radio station KMPC, be turned into an official cultural monument. However, this apparently has not been done. There was a couple reviews, but not too much, and they were both honestly kind of mid. Both the New York Times and the LA Times were a little bit mid on the Jazz Singer, so nothing juicy. But on that note, let's talk a little bit about the Jazz Singer. Anyone want to kick us off with this one?
My first thoughts are, which I put in our Slack.
Well,
his reputation as the first talking picture greatly inflated my expectation of dialogue, which you already got into in your little blurb, Zach. But I was shocked that it is like functionally a silent picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a silent picture with musical numbers and like a couple of stray lines here and there.
Yeah, and the one clip that you see over and over again, I think you definitely see it in Babylon. You see it in Singing in the Rain, I think, and it's like anytime you see any footage from The Jazz Singer, it's the first musical number, which comes like 25 minutes into the film. Like, it's like not short. It's like a long time before you hit that, and you're like, oh, now the picture's in sound. I thought it was going to be like a Wizard of Oz type thing, where all of a sudden, like, Dorothy opens the door and everything is in sound. And so I was expecting the movie to be from sound from that point on, and then it goes right back to the intertitles. And anyway, I know that this is just that's a reaction based on my misperception of the movie, but I was surprised given the movie's reputation at how little talking there actually is.
Yeah, the reputation of it being the first talkie definitely leaves a lot to be desired. The blackface obviously sucks, and we'll talk about that later. But also, it is worth pointing out this movie is just fucking boring. Like, this movie boring. Is 90 minutes. Usually the runtime people point to is like, this is going to be an absolute breeze. I could not bring myself to care about anything happening in this movie, man. It is so, flatly drawn. And so this movie, in my mind, feels like it has basically nothing going for it.
Well, like Zach mentioned, the other highest grossing films of 2027 or 1927, and I have not seen The King of Kings, but I've seen Wings, which is a visually stunning picture. Like, that is a very dynamic movie with zero sound, but it is riveting to watch because of the visual splendor of it. And there's nothing to watch in this movie. It's like we set up a camera on one side of the room, we have Al Jolson performing at the other side of the room. That's like the sum total of this movie's style.
And like Al Jolson doesn't even have a particularly charismatic screen presence. I'm sorry. Like I don't care about Al Jolson.
It's lost to time his sex appeal for sure.
It has to have been because the vitality and sex appeal. I'm like, this guy in his little suit. He looks like a stray character in a David Lynch movie.
He looks like a mortician or something. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I feel like we're pretty good at, like, you know, looking at it in a historical lens as well as a modern lens. But yeah, this is, in both of the lenses, just a boring fucking movie. Like, I don't know. Honestly,
I texted the group chat and said, like, in the middle of it, I was like, this movie is so goddamn boring, I can't wait for it to become racist.
Yeah.
That at least gives me something to think about.
For a reason, blackface are the most interesting, because that's where tension builds, and, like, there's this plot about whether he's gonna, like, pivot to just being the traditional, like, religious music, or whether he's gonna continue with his jazz life, and that's, like, when that gets most interesting. Zach, you had us, or you suggested that we read this article about, like, Jolson's blackface and, like, what that means in the context of its historical moment and, like, for black audiences at the time. And that's a really interesting question because, like, he dons blackface almost as, like, a symbol of his rejection of Jewishness. And, like, that's, like, a very fascinating thing to happen, and the movie doesn't really do a lot that's interesting with it, but, like, you start seeing stuff and you're like, oh, this is interesting. It's racist, but it's interesting.
If only this movie was interesting. Yeah.
If only. Yeah, it's briefly interesting.
It's such a, like, you know, kind of leading into the blackface and the it's such a out of nowhere, like, it's not like, no, I don't know what the moment was supposed to be presented, like, but there's no setup. It's just like you cut and you're in a room and he's getting ready and he's just getting ready with his blackface and you're just like, oh shit, oh, like, I'm just like, oh fuck, it's happening. It's here.
Very distracting because it's like an otherwise very emotional sequence where his, like, girlfriend is like, your father's dying, and he's like, the show must go on, and he's, like, putting on the blackface.
Because he puts on the what is it? What
it's
is
like
the
cork, right? It's
the cork? Yeah, he puts on the cork. It really kills me when he puts on the hair.
The wig.
Yeah,
oh my God.
And I'm just like, and that's when I was just like, no, Al.
And, like, the first song that he sings, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't even have to do with race. Like, it doesn't even feel like it is from a minstrel show. And then the one that he does at the very end of the movie, Mammy, obviously is. And, like, it's presented as his tribute to his mother, who is not black. He's just kind of, like, using the language of the African American community or minstrelsy.
Like, tears are pouring down his face as he's singing it.
But, like, I don't feel like there's any way to make this work, to be honest. Like, the article that you share with us, Zach, which people should look up if they're able to find it. It is called well, the name of the article is a little problematic in and of itself, but it's called "Why Did Negroes Love Al Jolson and the Jazz Singer: Melodrama, Blackface, and Cosmopolitan Theatrical Culture" by Charles Musser. And, like, the writer Musser tries to make the case that, like, because the conflict of the movie is about Al Jolson's own like, complicated feelings about his own race, he's kind of using blackface in kind of like a almost race neutral way. And, like, I just don't think there's a way for blackface to be race neutral. I'm sorry. Like, I don't think that there's any way in which this works in a movie unless it is, like, explicit satire, like in Spike Lee's Bamboozled.
Well, and, like, the article mentions that and Zach also mentioned this as well in his little forward to this, is that, like, minstrel minstrelry with blackface was such a common element of just like performed music at the time, and like a lot of the pull quotes from black critics at the time just assume that minstrelry is part of entertainment. Like they're, so they're basically like saying, of all the people doing blackface, Al Jolson seems like an all right guy. Like that's what a lot of the quotes sound like, which is like they're not quotes that are critics of minstrelry because it's just assumed to be part of the entertainment landscape. And that's kind of sad because like obviously the whole history of it is based on like the lampooning and, theft of like, black art. But like, I think the only way it works as race neutral is if we view minstrelry as an inevitability, but it's not. I mean, we're almost 100 years out of this, and minstrelry has not been a mainstream part of American culture for at least 70 of those 100 years, and
you could make the argument that like caricatures of African Americans persist in American media, and that's like a form of minstrelsy, but not like this. This is a different thing. Yeah,
it's not the same. It's not the same thing.
Yeah, well, it just. I don't know. It also just because the article or the piece of criticism also gets into like pretty much Al Jolson's career, which seems like this is very indicative of it. But I don't know if y'all remember the part where like he like recounts that this, I think it was a barber who was African American, like pretty much was like, you should do this, and he was like, okay. And
my black friends say I could say the N-word.
Like
it's
a lot
okay.
of like literally a lot of like the origin story of Al Jolson is like his black friends said it's okay, and I'm like, that doesn't still make it okay. And I don't know, like that's just such a, they're not going to get into it in the Jazz Singer, but like, but just in terms of like his biography, it seems like there's a lot of, not to be like crass, but like stepping on bodies in order to like rise himself, because it seems like he was utilizing a lot of affectations, musical styles, dancing styles, stuff like he was taking all that and elevating himself with it.
He reminds me a lot of, reading this historical background, he reminds me a lot of Elvis in the specifically in like appropriating black musical style, having like basically a rapport with black artists that made him feel licensed to do this sort of thing, and also like apparently a relentless promotion of other black artists that was basically futile because those black artists never received the stardom that he did. Like that's all the stuff that Elvis did too. And people will say that to kind of defend Elvis's legacy as like, one of the first great like white white burglars of black rock and roll. And like, I think like whatever his intentions were, the history speaks for itself. And I mean, like, whatever Al Jolson's intentions were, the history speaks for itself. There is not a single black performer from his era that is recognizable. There's nobody who gets like AFI, like, clips.
Paul Robeson, maybe?
Maybe. But
it seemed like Paul Robeson and even Bojangles Robinson were like very tertiary though. Like it wasn't like they were a part of his like circle that he was actively working with. I remember that they mentioned both of them, but I don't think that they were actively in his circle.
That's true. But like, Al Jolson is remembered for this role. It could have just as easily been like an actual black person. Like a lot of the tensions could still exist if you put an actual black person in there.
Well, and which
apparently that was in the original version of the story. This is an adaptation of both a play and a film. They don't involve blackface because the story doesn't need to include it.
That's what I was gonna say. Actually, no, you really you just didn't need the blackface. Like it seemed like the story itself is about like identity through his Jewish, like his Jewishness. Like that's what the movie is about. And then he just starts like appropriating black entertainment at the end of it for whatever reason.
And this is why I don't buy the theory that like, well, he's using blackface to reject his heritage, and whatever that means. Because like, he. Gosh, I can't even form a coherent sentence about how stupid this is. I'm sorry. Yeah, come back to me. I'll be able to form words about.
Well, I think it's not so much that what's problematic, I think, is that it's like rock bottom of his rejection of Jewishness is being black. Like, I think that's what's problematic about, like, besides like the inherent problematicness of blackface in general, like in the context of the movie's narrative, like the moment at which he is in the narrative abandoning his father on his deathbed is the moment he's putting on blackface. Like that's a narrative that the article that Zach had us read is trying to counteract, but I don't really buy the reading that the article gives, because in the context of the film, it's you're either performing in blackface or you're Jewish. Like that's the dichotomy he's given. Like
The two races.
the two races.
Yeah, okay, so I've gathered my thoughts here. The reason why he has to choose between his Jewish identity and being a performer is that, like, his dad wants him to, like, sing in synagogue. Like, he wants him to put his talent towards this Hebrew
To be a
art form.
What is it? It's like 5
cantor?
generations of cantors. So yeah.
Exactly.
Something like
yeah. And so, like, it reminds me of like High School Musical or something. It's like, I don't want to be on the fucking basketball team. I want to dance, you know. And his decision to put on blackface is just kind of part and parcel with wanting to dance, because, like you said, Michael, like in this era, being a song and dance man kind of almost necessitated doing blackface because it was so ubiquitous. So he's not making any sort of racial statement by donning blackface at the end of the movie. He's the only statement he's making is I want to be in the entertainment industry, and that's where blackface happens. And the movie is very neutral on that. It has no like racial politics, or I don't want to say it has no racial politics. Of course, this movie has racial politics, but it tries to obscure blackface as a thing that is in any way harmful to the black community.
Or it almost like puts it under the like, because I don't think it ever really like embraces the entertainment industry. It still kind of has a, like a tepid rejection of it. So it's kind of like, that's an entertainment industry stuff. I don't know what those crazy Hollywood people be doing, to a degree. And to kind of almost like distance itself. Yeah, I don't know, because It was interesting reading the criticism by Charles Musser, but also just kind of looking up more about, because he has this whole section at the beginning where he's talking about the source material. And actually, what was interesting was Ernst Lubitsch was very like involved in this process, pulling from.
But then he left Warner Brothers before he could make a screenplay.
Yeah,
right?
but
Is that what I read?
Yeah. He left before he could make a screenplay, but like very much like bringing the, and I guess he had seen Jolson perform like the Jazz Singer, the Broadway play before, and so, but it was just interesting, kind of on that level of like tying. Again, like going back to like what it seems like this movie's, like what the movie should be like focused on is just kind of challenging this Jewish identity. But I thought that the Musser piece also kind of gets into, I can't remember if it was that or just some other reading I did, but also it has a very narrow view of like what being Jewish is on top of everything else. Like,
you're either like Orthodox Jewish or you're like a godless entertainer.
The two religions.
And they were talking about the source material to the movie. And the movie, the kind of like break from being Jewish that he makes is you cut to him in, when he's older, eating ham and eggs. That kind of just says that like he's broken off. And in the source material, like I think they said it's a very dramatic moment where he has the curled hair and like cuts those off and then like leaves the family type situation, which seems much more dramatic and like indicative of that. But that's why, again, going to, it has just this kind of, I don't know. It's kind of using all of these in a very flippant way, but doesn't really. And maybe that would have made it honestly a much more interesting movie if it actually like kind of tried to deal with like the identities at hand here.
Do you know if Lubitsch ever used blackface in his films? I would imagine not. Because isn't he like a Jewish German immigrant who was aware of race and racism throughout his catalog? That's the ideological vibe that I get from Lubitsch.
You're probably right. I don't know if that precludes someone from, like, a lot of our understanding of blackface has to do with, like, and what's problematic of it has to do with, like, you know, a holistic view of the history of it that he might not have had access to.
No, it doesn't look like it. There was one that popped up, but it was about Emil Jannings, who, great actor, but it was a Nazi and I guess did blackface. So it's like double whammy.
Oh, wow. Dang.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is when I first heard this news that you texted us earlier today that like Lubitsch was originally going to be the director of this movie, and you know we've done a director series on Ernst Lubitsch. He's a favorite of people here on the Cemetery Podcast. It seems really sad to think about this movie in the form that exists now, just having Ernst Lubitsch's name on it. But I really don't think
Lubitsch
that
touch. It has none of the Lubitsch touch.
Well, I don't think that it would even have the blackface in it if it was an Ernst Lubitsch movie, because based on the biographical information we got from this article, it seems like the blackface comes from Jolson.
It comes
like
from Jolson because
has like this routine that he does.
Because clearly they wanted to like build it around his life, and then originally had the guy who was playing the role on Broadway, and that guy was just like, I don't want to do this. Like that, like he read it was like, nope, that seems bad.
Because it's not like there was nobody who was anti-blackface in the day of blackface.
Not, yeah.
It was still, you know, a contentious issue.
Do we like Gene Kelly? We like Gene Kelly. Did Gene Kelly at once do blackface? He did.
Oh yeah,
it's unfortunate.
Also, speaking of Gene Kelly, we should talk about Singing in the Rain for a minute.
Fred Astaire also did blackface.
I'm fine. I'm fine ditching Fred.
Swing Time's a great movie.
I think that this movie, and I haven't rewatched Singing in the Rain since the infamous early Cemetery podcast where I came out against it.
Damn, he came
I'm
hard.
Sure that Singing in the Rain is great, actually, and I was wrong. But it is a little weird to me that Singing in the Rain as a movie about the advent of talkies kind of whitewashes that history. And does not acknowledge that this was an aspect, a very major aspect of it.
Well, and we didn't have time to talk about Babylon, which was one of the movies that we were potentially going to talk about in part one. But Babylon doesn't exactly whitewash it, but it has a weird connection to the like racial dynamics of silent Hollywood as well. Like it's a weird. I don't know. Hollywood has a hard time like owning up to this period of time because it's just so bleak.
Which is what makes something like Bamboozled by Spike Lee such a fascinating piece of satire, because it's just it's so abrasive. Not even because of like typical Spike Lee stuff. It's just more abrasive because it's something that you never confronted. You've never really confronted like on a cinematic level like that. And so when it
has that ending montage where it's just a montage of black like minstrel performances in Hollywood pictures. Like it is like one of the most moving and troubling sequences in Spike Lee's whole career.
Yeah. It's like you know, it's Spike Lee working at one of his best registers, like really just kind of getting at it.
Just pissed the whole time.
Yeah, and it's a deeply disturbing movie, but it at least is something that like engages with that has never been done previously. I don't know what we talked.
I want to know what the remakes of The Jazz Singer did. Hopefully not blackface, but
I don't think so. The kind of like wrap up question or you know, to a degree that I wanted to get to is like we talked at the beginning, like this is supposed to be a very historically significant movie. It's kind of one of those where it's like if you're watching like the important movies of the early period, like this has to be on the list as that kind of first talkie picture, etc. Do y'all feel like that stands, or is this something that you can work around?
No.
You don't have to actually reckon with this we felt like we did.
You can watch the same 30-second clip that I always saw of the jazz singer, which is of him saying, "You ain't heard nothing yet," like the first spoken words that a lot of people heard in a Hollywood film. Like, because most of the movie, as we mentioned, is technically unremarkable. Like, it has a synchronized soundtrack of like a few sound effects and music, but otherwise there's a very little piece of it that's actually that historic significance people ascribe to it, and most of it is this boring shit that we've been talking about. That's my thoughts.
And we talked about this several years back when we did Birth of a Nation on the podcast, but certain movies that get pointed to as like codifying techniques that end up becoming foundational in cinema history are movies that you can't really be wowed by anymore because those techniques are so commonplace. Like, it is impossible for you as a modern audience member to sit down and be wowed by You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet, because you have heard synchronized sound in fucking everything your entire life. Like, it's just not interesting or exciting to see that happen for the quote-unquote first time, when it wasn't even really the first time. Zach and I were talking in the break about there's other movies at the time that didn't synchronize sound before it, in the same way that you could point to something like Lois Weber's Suspense, which does cross-cutting before Birth of a Nation did, and does it so much better.
And doesn't include blackface. It's so easy.
And doesn't include blackface.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, you look at like some of these early technical breakthroughs, and most of the early silent technical breakthroughs occur in short films. Like, you can watch the train arriving at the station in like 10 seconds, and that's fine. Like, that's great. You don't need to watch a whole feature film to understand the significance of synchronized talking in a picture. Like, you can watch like just an excerpt of what that is, and it is interesting to like think about that as being significant, like that little small bit, like less than 2 minutes of spoken word being so, I mean, to the extent there have been other talking films, I mean, this is the one that kind of like made it stick, I guess. So like, that it's historically significant in that way. But I don't think you need to watch the feature. Like, it's, you don't gain anything from seeing that in the film because it doesn't do anything cool with it. Like I said, I thought it was going to be like a Dorothy into Oz moment where like instantly the movie was full of sound, but it wasn't. Like, it's a technical experiment.
I'm glad that you brought up Wizard of Oz earlier, Michael, because that's a movie that is not by any stretch of the imagination the first color movie, but it is often a movie that film studies teachers will show as like an example of like transition from
it's fucking
black
amazing
and white
when
to
it
color,
happens.
because it's amazing. Like, they just they make it amazing even if you've seen color film your entire life, because of the way in which it's placed in the film. And there's just nothing like that in The Jazz Singer. It is not stunning in any way.
Skip it. Yeah, thumbs down. Honestly, like, I can't think of a single thing to recommend to it except the kind of academic interest from like the identity politics like we've been talking about. Like, because otherwise, like, I don't think Jolson's very good, like we talked about. Certainly no one else in this movie is very good. Like, the cinematic style is not good. The technical accomplishment is only of historical note. Like what does this movie have to offer to anybody?
I kept laughing at the fucking the neighbor guy who just kept coming over and stirring shit up. Dude came over and was like, "Your son's singing ragtime over there," and then was like, "Your son's."
He says raggy time.
Yeah, and he's like, "Your son sent you a letter." Like, he's just constantly. I'm like, "Get the hell out of here, man." It's like I'm just like, you're just coming in here stirring shit up. You're not helping anybody, you little asshole. No, I think there's other things that you could. Honestly, if you want to just get a gambit run of techniques and such, just watch Duck Amuck.
Yeah,
really.
I'm wondering though, now that I'm thinking about the Wizard of Oz comparison, is there a movie that you would point people to that like presents sound in a new way, in an early Two
That's a
movies
good
that jump
point.
out to my mind would be M by Fritz Lang.
Yeah, which is
which
often
uses
silent
the
film
whistling.
as well. Yeah.
And then also, Modern Times does a little thing where like the boss in the factory is the only person who has a voice, which is
Modern
neat.
Times is technically a sound movie, but
It's a little
barely.
later. It's a little later in the game, but I feel like just experimentally with sound, I would include Fantasia.
yeah, those like actually the first three Walt Disney like Snow White, Fantasia, and Bambi, like all three of those. Well, Pinocchio too. All three of those early Walt Disney films do really interesting stuff with like synchronized sound and music. Like this movie has synchronized music and it does basically nothing with it. But if you watch like Snow White, that movie does everything with synchronized music. Like there's all these musical cues to the movements and stuff. That's very interesting.
And they had to map them out to that animation too. That's
Yeah.
really impressive.
But
So go watch some early animation.
no,
the jazz singing.
definitely back to like go watch M, which is like it's which is an older movie that fucking still hits today. Like it's just
It's so
super
good.
scary.
M is very good.
It's super scary. It's super tense. Like definitely worth watching. That also is playing with sound. But yeah,
it's all.
Oh,
It's also
and-
that, like kind
and-
of transition too, where it kind of feels like halfway still in, like a foot still in the silent world.
another one is the obvious one as well with Chaplin, which is the beginning of City Lights.
Or the ending of Great Dictator. The tramp doesn't talk until the big speech at the end.
Chaplin was very much doing that more than others. But yeah. No, don't watch The Jazz Singer. It's on Tubi if you're that curious.
I watched it on Tubi.
Dude,
Yeah.
I'm gonna say Warner Brothers issued a 3-disc special edition that I checked out from the library. 3 discs. Like,
Fuck off.
I can't imagine what is on those other discs, like making of documentaries or something. But I watched the first disc, which is the film, and I had no interest whatsoever in any of the special features or any of that. I could have dug in hours to this stuff, but I decided not to. So skip that too.
Skip it.
All right, well, that will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/cinematary, on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/cinematary. We post all the movies that we talked about in this episode, as well as you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at handle @cinematary. If you'd like to support the show, patreon.com/cinematary. Thank you so much to our patrons. Cam, Chad Newsom, Candace Sisson, Ron Hayes, Teresa Marsathi, and Tyler Chandler. Thank you so much for supporting the show and giving us.
Can I make a quick note about
Go for it.
Patreon? We used to do a series on Patreon that we don't do anymore because there just wasn't that much interest in it, to be honest, called Film Theory and Chill, where we read through an academic article about cinema, and then we just kind of talked about whatever afterwards. We almost did something like that with the Jazz Singer episode today, with that article we were talking about throughout part 2. If that is the kind of thing that you would like to see more of, consider patronizing us on Patreon. If there's another idea for a thing that's not what we usually do that you think would be a good idea for a Patreon series, we would love to hear from you. But yeah, those are the kinds of things that we can really only do if we have more patrons and more engagement.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the Patreon, we have it set up now. I mean, you can just do $1 a month, but we'll be happy if that's something you want to see. But yeah, next week we're going to continue our Young Critics Watch Old Movies series. I'm pumped for this one. We're talking about 1930s All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yes.
Which should be good. I think there'll be some the second remake of it came out last year and was nominated for an Oscar for Best Picture and things like that. This one was also nominated for Best Picture, but I've seen 2 of the 3 adaptations now. I think this is head and shoulders above the rest, especially the most recent one. So it's gonna be a nice one. Well, not really a nice one. It's a very depressing movie, but you get what I'm saying.
Nice to see a good movie.
Yeah. Until next time, thank y'all for listening. We'll see you then.